Welcome to a Legendarium special about how Mary, Queen of Scots, ruled France. In this episode, we will talk about how young Mary spent most of her early years in France and ruled the country for 17 months before going home to Scotland. Mary, Queen of Scots, received her title at the ripe old age of 9 months after her father, King James V, came down with a slight case of death. He died in the opening salvo of a bloody war between Scotland and King Henri VIII of England, known as the Rough Wooing, when Henri tried to force the infant Mary to wed his only son, 5-year-old Edward VI. Scotland's fortune suffered so badly that Scottish notables begged the French for help. On June 16, 1548, more than 100 French ships brought an army of 6,000 French, German, and Italian veterans of the Italian Wars to Leith. That same summer, King Henri II of France sent his personal galley to Dumbarton to take the 5-year-old Mary, Queen of Scots, to his kingdom. The Queen Mother, torn between her wish to care for her still very young daughter and the need to stay in Scotland to protect little Mary's inheritance, chose to stay in Scotland. On July 29th, little Mary took a tearful farewell of her mother and boarded the French royal ship. For 9 horrible days, severe weather kept the French fleet trapped in the Firth of Clyde, and it only sailed on August 7th, arriving in Brittany after a storm-tossed voyage of 6 days. It would be the first of many storms that young Mary endured. Yet upon her arrival in Paris, the young Mary found herself surrounded by luxury. As the royal household moved from palace to palace, a huge retinue of servants followed. Mary had her own chaplain who carried her personal communion vessels from place to place for celebrating Mass. Her wardrobe included little dresses of gold damask, bonnets of silver thread, embroidered caps with fur trimmings, and deerskin gloves. Along with a rigorous education in Spanish and Italian, she studied dancing, singing, and playing the lute. Of course, she learned to speak fluent French and styled herself as a French princess, signing her name Marie Stewart. In staunchly Catholic France, she also imbibed the old faith with her mother's milk. King Henri II of France resolved to marry his sickly son Francois and the young Marie Stuart. Such a union would fortify the long-standing Auld Alliance between Scotland and France. However, King Henri II included secret agreements in the treaty which the 14-year-old Mary unknowingly signed. Officially, it would unite the kingdoms of France and Scotland, not an unappealing prospect for the latter. However, King Henri's secret clauses ensured that Scotland would come under French rule even if Mary and Francois did not have a child. This would have reduced Scotland to a mere appendage of France, and if this had become public knowledge, would have likely led to open rebellion. On April 24, 1558, 15-year-old Mary and the 14-year-old Francois married with spectacular pageantry in Notre Dame Cathedral. The Cardinal Archbishop of Rouen presided over the ceremony with King Henri II in attendance. For once he invited Queen Catherine de' Medici, though he also invited his chief mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Princes and princesses of the blood joined a glittering throng of high clergy and nobles. The Duke of Guise served as master of ceremonies. Mary of Scotland wore a white dress with a long train borne by 2 girls, a diamond necklace, and a golden coronet studded with jewels. Pierre de Brantôme described Mary as 100 times more beautiful than a goddess of heaven. Her person alone was worth a kingdom. A grand banquet in the Palais de Justice followed, with dancing lasting far into the night. In the weeks that followed, King Henri II took one of Mary's ladies-in-waiting, Janet Stewart, as a new mistress. Once the other Scots realized what King Henri II was up to, they took Janet home to Scotland. There she gave birth to Henri, Bâtard de Valois, the most famous of King Henri II's 3 illegitimate children. Mary could not have known that she became a pawn in King Henri's scheme to control Scotland, but fate would overturn the royal chessboard. France and the Holy Roman Empire ended their latest war in Italy with the Treaty of Chateau Cambrésis on April 2, 1559. King Henri II of France likely considered this treaty, like so many before it, only a temporary truce before he began fighting again. Nonetheless, he celebrated the treaty with a grand tournament. King Henri II performed successfully, defeating both the Dukes of Guise and Nemours in the joust. Next, he faced a Scottish knight named Gabriel de Montgomery, who knocked the king out of his saddle. The 40-year-old King Henri II insisted on remounting for one final chance at Montgomery, and the second time, the Scotsman's lance struck Henri in the face and shattered. Spectators saw blood spurting from King Henri's helmet. The entire crowd howled in anguish as attendants rushed forward. Once the king's attendants removed his helmet, his wife looked at him and passed out. Several large splinters stuck out of his eyes and head. Doctors rushed him inside the palace, and from a surgery table in the Château de Tournai, doctors removed 5 massive splinters from King Henri's head. One of the splinters drove straight through his eye and into his brain. Such damage would have been nearly impossible to survive even with modern medicine. On July 10, 1558, King Henri II of France died, leaving the throne to his son, King Francois II, and Queen Marie Stewart. At the age of 18, the Scottish princess became the Queen of France. Though he reached the age of majority at 15, King Francois II proved a weak, sickly, and inexperienced youth who allowed his de Guise uncles to rule France. Their ascent infuriated the lower nobility, and some young Protestants hatched the Amboise conspiracy, a scheme to kidnap the young king and thus take control of the government. After the Guise family learned of the plot, the conspirators attacked the royal chateau anyway on March 19, 1560. Of course, the Guise family retainers crushed the conspirators, and for a week the torture, quartering, and hangings went on, with the Guise retainers throwing mangled corpses into the Loire River. Yet this did not bring the Guise family or France peace for very long. On December 5, 1560, the feeble King Francois II died of an ear infection after only 17 months on the throne. Since he had no children, his 10-year-old brother Charles IX followed him to the throne, and young Charles did not inspire confidence. The young monarch cried the entire way through his coronation, never let his mother out of his sight, and made her sleep in his bedroom after he became King of France. No one knew it at the time, but France, under this woefully inexperienced young king, hurled into what would become known as the Wars of Religion, a bitter series of conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. Perhaps sensing what came, young Mary decided to go home. In April 1561, 2 Scottish delegations arrived in Paris to prepare for Mary's return. The Catholic Earl of Huntly sent one, promising an army of 20,000 men to restore Scotland to the Church. Another, the Protestant delegation, led by Mary's half-brother Lord James Stewart, urged her to accept the Reformation and not bring the wars of religion to Scotland. Lord Stewart told his half-sister, "Above all things, madam, for the love of God, do not press matters of religion, not for any man's counsel on this earth." Mary, proved shrewd enough to accept this advice. Scotland would remain Protestant provided she could attend Catholic services in private. On August 14, 1561, the 19-year-old Mary left Calais on a great white galley bound for Scotland, where she would become Mary, Queen of Scots. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.